You pull up the news and within 30 seconds you're reading about Iran again. Sanctions, missiles, uranium enrichment at 60%. Death to America chants outside some government building in Tehran. And honestly, if you're like most people watching this, your first reaction is probably something like, why? Why does this country seem so permanently, almost pathologically angry at the United States? Because from the outside, it genuinely looks irrational. America offers talks, Iran escalates. America applies sanctions, Iran enriches more uranium. America pulls back, Iran fires missiles at regional bases. It looks like a country that just decided, one day, for no particular reason, to make America its permanent enemy, and has been running that same script ever since. But that's not what happened. Not even close. What actually happened is one of the most consequential and least understood stories in modern geopolitics. And it didn't start in 1979. It didn't start with Khomeini. It didn't even start with the hostage crisis, which is where most Western coverage begins and ends. To actually understand why Iran and America are where they are today, you have to go back further, much further. Because the thing that drives Iran's behavior right now, the deep structural mistrust, the refusal to back down even when backing down would obviously make economic sense, the willingness to absorb enormous pain rather than give Washington what it wants. All of that has roots that go back not decades, but centuries. And once you see those roots clearly, everything happening in the news today stops looking random. It starts making a very specific kind of sense. So let's go back to the beginning. Not all 3,000 years, that would take a semester. But we need to start in the early 1900s, because that's when the chain of events that leads directly to today gets set in motion. Iran, or Persia as it was then called, had been one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. Cyrus the Great, Darius, the Persian Empire that stretched from Greece to India. By the time the 20th century rolled around, that empire was long gone, but the memory of it was still very much alive in Iranian culture and identity. Persians didn't think of themselves as some small Middle Eastern country. They thought of themselves as the heirs to one of history's greatest powers, temporarily weakened but fundamentally proud. That pride matters because pride is exactly what keeps getting stepped on by the events that follow. In 1908, oil was discovered in Iran. Massive deposits, enormous potential. And almost immediately, a British company called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would later become BP, moved in and took control of it. The terms were absurd. Iran got roughly 16% of the profits. Britain kept the rest. British engineers ran the facilities. British managers lived in segregated housing. Iranian workers did the hard labor and got almost nothing. For 40 years, this arrangement continued. And for 40 years, resentment built up inside Iran, like pressure in a sealed container. Then in 1951, a man named Mohammad Mossadegh became prime minister. He was a lawyer, educated in Europe, deeply nationalist, and absolutely clear about one thing: Iran's oil belonged to Iran. He stood before Parliament and made the case for nationalization. Parliament voted overwhelmingly in favor. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was seized. The British were expelled. And for a brief, extraordinary moment, Iranians felt like they had taken their country back. Britain responded with a boycott. They convinced most of the world not to buy Iranian oil. Iran's economy started to suffer, but Mossadegh held firm. He was enormously popular. When the Shah at one point tried to fire him, Iranians poured into the streets in such numbers that the Shah had to back down and reinstate him. That's how much this man was loved. Then came August 1953, and this is the moment that changes everything. The CIA, working with British intelligence MI6, launched a covert operation called Operation Ajax. They hired street mobs in Tehran. They bribed newspaper editors to run anti-Mossadegh propaganda. They paid religious leaders to denounce him. They staged fake communist attacks to make it look like the country was falling into chaos. And over 4 days, they engineered a coup. Mossadegh was arrested. The Shah was reinstalled as a fully American-backed absolute monarch. and Iran's first democratic leader was put under house arrest for the rest of his life, dying there years later, having never been free again. Now here's why this matters so much. The United States in 1953 was publicly claiming to be the champion of democracy and self-determination around the world. That was the entire ideological foundation of the Cold War. America stood for freedom. The Soviets stood for oppression. And here was Iran, with a democratically elected leader who had done exactly what democratic leaders are supposed to do: represent the will of his people, and the CIA removed him because his decision to nationalize oil threatened British and American corporate interests. The CIA's own documents, declassified decades later, make this clear. In 2013, the agency formally admitted its central role in the coup. Iranians knew what happened in 1953. They knew it long before the CIA admitted it, and what they drew from it was not complicated. The West talks about democracy, but when your democracy produces results the West doesn't like, they will destroy it. That lesson did not fade with time. It hardened. The Shah they put back in power, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, ruled for the next 26 years with full American support. And he was not a gentle ruler. He created a secret police force called SAVAK, which the CIA and Israel's Mossad helped train. SAVAK imprisoned, tortured, and killed dissidents. The number of political prisoners in Iran under the Shah reached into the tens of thousands. Meanwhile, American presidents visited Tehran and praised the Shah in glowing terms. Jimmy Carter, in 1977, stood beside the Shah at a state dinner and called Iran an island of stability and described the Shah as a man who was deeply admired throughout the world. He said this while SAVAK was running torture chambers across the country. The gap between what America said and what America did was not invisible to Iranians. It was the dominant reality of their lives. When America said it cared about human rights, Iranians watched American weapons being sold to the regime that was crushing their family members. When America said it cared about sovereignty, Iranians remembered 1953. And when the revolution finally came in 1979 and the Shah fled, the emotion in Tehran was not just anti-Shah. It was specifically, deliberately, pointedly anti-American. The U.S. Embassy wasn't just a foreign diplomatic facility to Iranians. It was the place that, in their understanding, had been running Iran's authoritarian government for 26 years. It was the operational heart of everything they hated. When Khomeini returned from exile in February 1979, the crowd that greeted him at the airport was measured in the millions. And one of the first things the new revolutionary government did was change the name of the street where the U.S. Embassy sat. They renamed it after Bobby Sands, the Irish Republican hunger striker. The symbolism was clear. This embassy was a symbol of foreign occupation. Then came November 4, 1979. Iranian students climbed the walls of the U.S. Embassy and took 66 Americans hostage. They would hold them for 444 days. From an American perspective, this was an outrage, a violation of every norm of international diplomacy. And it was. But from the perspective of the students who did it, they weren't attacking diplomats. They were attacking what they believed was the same intelligence operation that had overthrown Mossadegh and could, at any moment, try to overthrow their revolution too. When the Shah arrived in America for cancer treatment that October, the students interpreted it as the first step in a U.S. plot to restore him to power. Their fear wasn't irrational given what had happened 26 years earlier. It was, in fact, historically grounded. The hostage crisis lasted over a year, destroyed Jimmy Carter's presidency, and burned into American consciousness as the defining image of Iran. Fanatics, chants, burning flags. That image is still how most Americans picture Iran today. But the hostage crisis was a response to something. It didn't emerge from nowhere. Then came the Iran-Iraq War, and this is where another layer of bitterness gets cemented permanently. In 1980, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. It was an unprovoked attack. Iraq moved into Iranian territory, hoping to capitalize on the post-revolutionary chaos. Iran fought back, and the war ground on for 8 years at horrific cost. At least 500,000 people died, possibly far more. Cities were bombed, entire generations of young men were consumed by the trenches, and during all of this, the United States supported Iraq. Not secretly, not quietly. Washington provided Saddam Hussein with satellite intelligence showing Iranian troop positions. American intelligence officials later confirmed, in declassified documents reviewed by Foreign Policy magazine, that they passed this information to Iraq fully knowing that Iraq would use it to launch chemical weapons attacks. Sarin, mustard gas, nerve agents, used against Iranian soldiers in battle after battle, with U.S. intelligence guidance helping direct the strikes. Tens of thousands of Iranians were killed or permanently injured by chemical weapons, while the Reagan administration not only looked the other way but actively blocked United Nations condemnation of Iraq's actions. Then, on July 3, 1988, the USS Vincennes, an American warship operating inside Iranian territorial waters, shot down Iran Air Flight 655. A commercial Airbus carrying 290 people on a routine flight from Tehran to Dubai. Everyone on board died. 66 of them were children. The United States never formally apologized. The captain of the Vincennes, William Rogers, was later awarded the Legion of Merit for his service. The medal was given for his entire tour, not specifically for shooting down the airliner. But the optics in Iran were exactly what you'd expect. America killed 290 Iranian civilians and then gave its officer a commendation. Iran knows about that flight the way America knows about September 11th. It is commemorated every year. Iranian state television airs footage of mourners throwing flowers into the Persian Gulf at the coordinates where the plane went down. A professor at the University of London told NBC News that the incident continues to be a national trauma for Iranians, and that Iran today believes the United States does not care about Iranian lives. That belief did not appear out of thin air. It was manufactured by events. Now, here's where it gets complicated in a different way. Because the story is not simply one of America as villain and Iran as innocent victim. Iran has done genuinely dangerous and destabilizing things. It has supported Hezbollah, which has killed civilians. It has backed proxy militias across the region. Its nuclear program raises real and legitimate concerns. The Iranian government has brutally suppressed its own people. The 2009 Green Movement, the 2019 fuel protests, the 2022 Woman Life Freedom Uprising, all crushed with violence. None of that is excused by the history. But the history is what makes Iran's decisions comprehensible, which is different from making them justifiable. What the history explains is why, when America applies pressure, Iran doesn't fold. Every time Washington has expected maximum pressure to produce Iranian capitulation, it has instead produced Iranian consolidation. The pattern repeats because the Iranian government can point to 1953, to the Shah, to Savak, to Iraq, to the Vincennes, and say, look what happens when you trust the Americans. Look what happens when you show weakness. And significant portions of the Iranian population, even those who deeply oppose the government, recognize that this argument has historical weight. You can hate the regime and still understand that its foreign policy instincts were formed by real experiences, not paranoia. The 2015 nuclear deal was perhaps the one moment when a different trajectory seemed possible. Iran agreed to dramatically limit its uranium enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief. For a brief window, the Iranian economy breathed. European companies started returning. There was something that felt, tentatively, like the beginning of normalization. And then, in 2018, the United States unilaterally walked out of the agreement. Not because Iran had violated it, the IAEA confirmed Iran was in compliance, but because the Trump administration considered it a bad deal. The sanctions came back harder than ever. The Iranian economy collapsed. The currency lost most of its value. And the hardliners in Tehran, who had argued from the beginning that you cannot trust American agreements, were completely vindicated in the eyes of many Iranians. After that, Iran started enriching uranium beyond the limits set in the deal. The breakout timeline, the time it would take to have enough enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon, compressed dramatically. By the mid-2020s, Iran had enriched uranium to 60% purity, not far from the 90% needed for a weapon. American officials and Israeli officials increasingly talked about military options. The cycle that began with a CIA agent named Kermit Roosevelt arriving in Tehran with suitcases full of cash in 1953 had led, 70 years later, to a region closer to catastrophic war than at any point since. Here's the thing that most news coverage never tells you. This is not a conflict between two countries that simply have different interests and can't find a compromise. It's a conflict where one side, the Iranian side, has accumulated 70 years of specific documented experiences that tell a very clear story. America will support you when it suits their interests and remove you when it doesn't. America will shake your hand in public and undermine you in private. America will talk about your sovereignty and then sell weapons to the government torturing your citizens. That is not Iranian propaganda. That is the historical record. Understanding this doesn't mean defending Iran's government or its actions. It means understanding why the anger is structural, not circumstantial. Why it doesn't dissolve with a new administration in Washington. Why Iranian leaders who want engagement always find themselves outflanked by hardliners whose position is constantly validated by events. The hostility runs deep, not because Iranians are irrational, but because they have a long memory and the record gives them plenty of material to remember. The next time you see a headline about Iran, nuclear talks collapsing, a new round of sanctions, missiles fired across the region, you now have the context that most people watching the same news don't have. You know about Mossadegh. You know about Operation Ajax. You know about SAVAK and the 26 years of American-backed authoritarian rule that preceded 1979. You know about the Iran-Iraq War and the chemical weapons. You know about Flight 655 and the 290 people who never made it to Dubai. You know that the nuclear deal worked, that Iran complied, and that America walked away anyway. None of that makes the current situation easy to solve. If anything, knowing the history makes it harder, because you understand exactly why the trust deficit is so massive and exactly what would be required to close it. But at the very least, when you see the chants and the flags and the rhetoric, you're no longer looking at something that seems to come from nowhere. You're looking at the end of a very long road, and you can trace every step that led there. That's the only starting point for anything that might eventually look like a solution. If this kind of deep context breakdown is what you come here for, you know what to do. There's a lot more of this coming.